How many of you saw the presentation in Dayton? A few. Okay, good. So for a lot of you, this is new. For those of you who saw the presentation in Dayton, it was actually Dan and Darroch and myself. So as Carl said, there's some new stuff in here for those of you who saw it already, and hopefully we'll just keep it ticking along here. I've got a little bit of video to show you. I'm not going to give you the history of the Lafayette Escadrille. I'm sure most of you are at least somewhat familiar with it, if not very familiar with them. But I will touch on that. Mostly what I'm going to be talking about is sort of how we're approaching the story and the kind of resources that we're pulling together to make it something that is as engaging and as, oh my God, I can't believe this. The thing that we keep saying to each other, we're writing the script for the film right now, is we just could never have made this up. And why people have decided to fictionalize this story, I just cannot understand. These guys are just amazing. So it's a real pleasure for us to kind of uncover this story and just immerse ourselves in it and then just get out of the way and let it tell itself. Our point of entry to the story is actually through family members of the Lafayette Escadrille, a very chance meeting, but we do think of them as a family of a sort, and that kind of grew on its own. And the way we started learning about them was actually first by meeting their family members and hearing about them from them. It starts in Las Vegas, where Dan Patterson, these are his photographs, Dan's a very accomplished and well-known photographer, was on assignment out there photographing these Cirrus airplanes for some publication, I forget exactly what, and the Cirrus sales rep was there working with him, and Dan's up on the ladder, and the sales rep, they're just chatting, and the sales rep happens to say, well, my great-granduncle was a World War I pilot, and turns out this is Regis de Ramel, who's up there on the ladder, and his great-granduncle was Norman Prince, one of the founders of the unit. So Dan goes sliding down the ladder like, what? And so they start a conversation, and that's where it began. That's Regis on the left and his identical twin brother Guillaume on the right. They were born in France. Their first language was French, but they are American. Their mom's American. She's the one who's the granddaughter of Freddie Prince, who was Norman's brother, also in the Escadrille. And these two guys just couldn't be, well, they look like they just walked out of G Theater. They're the nicest guys on the planet, and they're both pilots, and it just really runs deep in the family. And so this is kind of where we started really, the story was kind of already alive for us because it's very much alive for them and many of the other family members who we've met. So Dan and I got an assignment from Aerospace to write this article, and this was our first attempt at getting our arms around the story and explaining it, in this case in only 3,000 words or less, which is really hard to do. You wind up leaving most of it out, and trying to get to the really salient points and really make it punchy and something that's accurate but also engaging and really readable. But we took that idea of family and kept going with it. So this is a picture that I shot when I interviewed Regis at his airfield, one of his airfields near Philadelphia. And the commander of the unit was a guy named Captain Georges Tenot. And that guy is Captain Georges Tenot. He's his grandson, and he flies for American Airlines. And he lives in Florida, and he's an awful nice guy. And one of his fathers, Georges Tenot II, one of his father's engines, he was a jet engine designer, is out here on the floor, here at housing. And as it happened, Regis was like, oh, George, what was cool was the first time they met, the very first thing they said to each other was, bonjour, and they just launched off in French. But they're these very American guys. And so, again, for us, like, okay, this French-American thing, it's real, and it goes deep with these guys. And Regis takes Georges out to, look at, this is the first Cirrus that he bought. He's got his own FBO now, and they all have little Lafayette Escadrille insignia on them. Another connection that happens, these are photographs Dan shot for the story. The woman there on the left is Nancy Hall Rutgers. She's the daughter of James Norman Hall. And she lives actually in Tahiti, part of the time where she was born and raised, because he lived there. That's her husband, Nick Rutgers. And this is their grandson, Lieutenant Colonel Nick Rutgers, who is an F-15 pilot. And his father flew combat in Vietnam, and his grandfather flew combat in World War II, and his great-grandfather was James Norman Hall. And if that isn't enough, he looks just like him. It is extraordinary. And again, he's the nicest guy in the world. But what meeting these people really brought out for us, and when you talk to them about it, is I had a long conversation the other day on the phone with James McConnell's niece, grandniece actually. And she just talks about how Uncle Jim was just this character in her life that she grew up with. Her father was a very well-known, famous journalist, and her mother was a very famous sculptor whose work is in the National Gallery. And Alexander's like, but Uncle Jim just kind of hangs over all of us, you know. And so that's the thing, is the story of the Lafayette Escadrille is very much alive in these people's worlds. And that's kind of that's the essence of what we're trying to bring out in this film, is we're starting to understand how they feel about it. And we're trying to bring that feeling forward. So our second attempt to tell the story was actually financed by Guillaume de Ramel. It was an exhibit at the Redwood Museum and Athenaeum, thank you so much, in Newport, Rhode Island. How many of you have ever been to an Athenaeum? I've never been to one. I felt very special. It's actually the oldest library in the country. It's been operating since 17, and it's really nice. But they have a nice little exhibit hall, and Guillaume wanted us to do an exhibit about Norman's role in the Escadrille. And it's for those of you who know the story, Norman's role is a touchy subject, because after the war, when they were building the big memorial that you saw on my first slide there in Paris, Norman's father, Frederick Henry Prince Sr., who owned the Chicago stockyards and had more money than God, wanted to turn the whole thing into a memorial for Norman. And Bill Thaw, who was the other co-founder of the unit, said, yeah, no. And it became quite a big thing, and Frederick Henry Prince pulled Norman physically out of the crypt that's in Paris, and he's buried in this very beautiful tomb at the National Cathedral. And so, you know, it's kind of, yeah. But the Prince family is very open about all that, but the old man was, when Tenot published his memoir about the Lafayette Escadrille, he published it in France, and he sent the English version here, and Frederick Henry Prince got the manuscript and said, I'll take care of it. And he just added bits about Norman into the manuscript without telling Tenot that he'd done it. Yeah, nice guy. So they had a lovely little thing. David McCullough came to see it, and I wasn't able to go, but Dan got his elbows rubbed, which was fun. So this is a shot from the Millionaires Unit. How many of you have seen the film? Has anybody seen it? Carl's seen it? Okay. Yeah, the distribution of the film is slow right now in getting it out. But it premiered at Oshkosh, and it's been shown at several festivals. And if you go to, I'll put the website up at the end. You can get a DVD of it right now. But the film is finished and coming out. Darroch Greer directed it, longtime documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles. And I met Darroch at Oshkosh, where he was showing a rough cut, an early version of the film, and I was showing a reconstruction I'd done of some Wright brothers footage. And we got drinking beer, and turned out we liked each other very much. And so we just kept in touch, and he read the article that Dan and I wrote, and he called me up and said, Paul, you want to make a film? And I said, absolutely. Because when you see this film, The Millionaires Unit, and I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, the flying sequences that they shot at Peter Jackson's place in New Zealand are just stunning. It's just a beautiful, beautiful film, and a beautiful story, very well told and very engaging. So that's kind of how our team came together. And really the way we're approaching this is through character, is through people. That's what gets people interested in your story, is what did the people do? What were they like? We talk a lot amongst ourselves about the audience for this film. Who is it? And really, we'd love all of you to see our film and come away feeling, wow, they really got it. It's accurate. It tells the story in a way that really holds up to scrutiny, honestly. We have no intention of, like I said before, we couldn't make this up, so why fool with any of the facts? But we also want somebody who's never even thought about, forget World War I aviation, World War I, to watch this film and just be blown away by the quality of the characters. And that's the thing that keeps coming over to us over and over. Balsley, Lufberry, McConnell, Norman Prince. Just for starters, and this is almost a random shot that I grabbed, and each one of these guys, even Balsley was shot down on his first mission, but his descriptions of what happened to him and his convalescence are just tear your heart out. Lufberry is this sort of superhuman, sphinx-like, mystical creature. McConnell is this guy who used to play his bagpipes in his kilt at UVA and drive everybody nuts, and apparently there was some big unveiling of a statue at UVA, and he put a chamber pot in the statue's lap, and they pulled the thing off, and there it is, and he almost got expelled. Norman Prince actually learned to fly at the Wright Brothers Flying School in Georgia in 1911, the winter of 1911. The flight logs are here at the archives. And Starling Burgess tells the story of the two of them on the train going down there, and Norman's father has forced him into law school, and he doesn't want to go, but he's brought the law school books anyway, and he's changed his name to George Manners so his father won't know that he's going to flight school. And Burgess talks about him sitting there with a big stack of law books, and he just, one by one, he's just picking them up and throwing them across and the nice neat stack becomes this pile of this stuff, and he was this wild, impetuous guy, and, But the thing that really grabs us over and over and over with these guys is that none of them in a big way had any business being there because they were volunteers. It wasn't even their fight. No one would have thought, well, you should be volunteering to go to France. They just did it. Some of them just happened to be there when the war started. Quite an extraordinary moment, the famous moment when Pershing's, I forget his name, the colonel who said, Lafayette, we are here. Well, a year earlier, Captain Tennot had come to Lafayette's tomb on July 4th, 1916. And it was right after they'd all come from the American, not all of them, but most of them had come from the American Cathedral for the service for Victor Chapman, the first guy killed. And several of them had already been in the war from the beginning. So the big Lafayette, we are here moment is preceded by these guys who just did it. And that just kind of blows us away. So we've been digging into kind of how they came together. Was it just this random bunch of guys who were there? Or how did they all happen to come together? And I'll leave this up and you guys can take a look at it. I had a hard time keeping them all straight. We'll turn on the lights so you can see this thing. And I intended to make a one-page spreadsheet that I could just have on my screen and kind of see the guys. And just so I could just keep their names and their faces straight in my head. And it turned into this. The big gray bar is the war. So everything above it is before the war, and then the war ends here. So this right here is the beginning of the war. And red is Foreign Legion service, green is Ambulance Corps, purple is flight training, blue is escadrille. So you can see that, until we get to Chris Ford, the last one. And then the escadrille goes out of service here, and then if they were in the war, or if they were killed, or in some cases they just resigned and left, what happened to them. And what we really started paying attention to was actually which units they were in the Foreign Legion or the Ambulance Corps, and what schools they went to. And if you look at this little chart here, this is pulled directly from the spreadsheet. If you look at Harvard, almost a quarter of them went to Harvard. And several of them were at the school at the same time. Lovell, Cowden, Prince, Fred Prince, and Rumsey. Hinkle was there as an architecture, the guy who was the oldest one. He was 40 when he joined. And then these guys who came, Chapman's one of the founding members. So just Harvard alone, Jim McConnell and Choo Choo Johnson were classmates at UVA Law School, and Courtney Campbell was there while he came a little bit later, but he was there at the same time. Yale, Bill Thaw he left the class of 15, and Ray Bridgman left the class of 1917. And Bridgman is there while the first Yale unit, which is the story of the Millionaires Unit, is getting going. So these things there's connections that are there even before the war. So before the Escadrille, several of them have fought together in the trenches. In the Foreign Legion, in one unit you had Bill Thaw, Kiffin Rockwell, Bert Hall, and Paul Pavelka. In another unit, Chapman, Kiffin moves to that unit, Edmund Genet, Dugan, and Subrian. Here's Victor Chapman, Edmund Genet, and William Dugan, all the same unit in the Foreign Legion. And that's Gene Bullard, who later becomes a member of the Lafayette Flying Corps. In the Ambulance Corps, in Section 2, look how many of the guys were there. I've got a question mark by Johnson because I don't know exactly which section Choo Choo Johnson was in. He was in one or two, I don't know. But you can just see just the number of people who were in the Ambulance Corps, and that's a pretty tight group too. So there's a lot of connections that are made, and as they start moving into, as Thaw and Bert Hall and get into and Elliot Cowden get into and Norman Prince start moving into French aviation. You know, this network of Americans, there weren't that many of them there. You know, that's how it starts. They start moving towards the airplanes, and then when the Escadrille is formed, they're easy to pick. So that's kind of how we get these guys coming together, and why there's such a strange disparateness to them. You know, a lot of times it's, you know, well, most of them were wealthy, and, you know, this was seen as a big adventure for them, and or they had family ties to France. So there's some of them, there's kind of a homogeneousness to them amongst the wealthy guys. There's some of them who are real scrappy. And then there's guys like Bert Hall and Ron Lufbery, who, even though they're very different people, they have something together too. They're both neither really had any formal education. They both have been living by their wits. These are guys who can just, you know, Bert make up, you know, huge sections of what his life was, just invent stuff, and then Lufbery, you couldn't make up the stuff that he's done, because there's been so much as he's traveled around the world since the time he was a teenager. So there's, what we're really trying to get out of this is this really interesting character study of the different types of guys who came into this, how they were connected before, and then how they changed as the war proceeded, as they invented this thing, as they invented the squadron. And one of the things that's really interesting is that when the Escadrille begins, their most experienced pilot is Bill Thaw and Norman Prince to a certain extent. But they've never been fighter pilots before. There are no veteran fighter pilots to show them what to do. Not that they're, you know, a veteran fighter pilot was somebody who'd been doing it for a year. But they didn't even have that. So there's a lot that really goes into this. And it's funny, Captain Tennow's memoir says, you know, these guys loved each other and there was camaraderie all the time. And Captain Tennow, I guess, had some rose-colored glasses because these guys could really go at it when they wanted to. So, yeah, as an example of contrasts of these guys. So here's Victor Chapman on the left and Lawrence Rumsey on the right. Chapman is descended from a founding father, John Jay, of the United States. Comes from a very wealthy family. He's a very devout Catholic. He's very, he's this sort of big, burly, sensitive, caring, hell for leather, complicated guy who writes these exquisite letters about how beautiful it is to fly, but also was in the trenches and would just charge at anything. And it's eventually what gets him killed. And that's why he's got the big bandage on his head there. Tenno had told him, do not attack, stay with me. But as soon as Chapman sees a German, he's just off, and they all go into this melee, and several of them got pretty busted up. So, and they love him. The guys love him. He's Harvard, class of 13. Lawrence Rumsey is Harvard, class of 07. I mean, the fact that just to survive training and being in the ambulance corps and having the persistence to go through this and just get to the escadrille does say something about his character. But at the same time, were his nerves so shot that he was drunk most of the time he was in the escadrille? I think only flew a half dozen missions. And then eventually, Tenno just kind of had him leave. You know, the character studies are the contrasts are very interesting indeed. And Lawrence Rumsey, to his credit, you know, he went home and unlike, I think it's 4,000 men claimed membership in the Lafayette Escadrille after the war to try and cash in on it, and he never did. Courtney Campbell. How many of you are familiar with this picture? Yeah, okay, so this is real. He was doing aerobatics. Courtney Campbell's favorite thing to do was to come up behind one of his own men while they're on patrol and get so close to his tail that the guy in front thought he was going to cut him to pieces because he just thought it was fun. There's another time that he flies down, and it was their next French commander, whose name escapes me for the moment. He'd like to fly right as close as he could to the top of the airplane, get his wheels as close to their head as he could, and then the two planes locked. And now they're both basically dead until Courtney Campbell just, you know, oh, this is fun, and he just pulls it back and blank, he pulls the airplanes apart, and neither of them came apart, and they both landed, and he thought it was fun.
That was the executive officer, Arnaud de Maison Rouge.
Maison Rouge.
Came down shaking and sputtering about those sauvage Americains.
Well, this is a time where he comes back from patrol, and he's doing aerobatics, and he goes up, and his lower left wing just rips off at the root, flutters away, and he lands the damn thing in a beet field. And look at that grin. I'm invincible. Well, he wasn't. He didn't last all that long. Bill Thaw and Bill Dugan, a contrast of two Bills. So both of them holding the, that's whiskey, that's soda. Both of them joined the war at the beginning of the war. Both of them lasted the duration. Both of them were deeply admired and respected. They were fierce fighters. They partied harder than anybody else. Bill Thaw was younger. Bill Thaw was only 22, I think. But Bill Thaw was the leader, absolutely. He was one of the founding members. Ted Parsons says he was the de facto commander, and which is not to take anything away from Bill Dugan, you know?
Thaw was the only officer.
Thaw was the only officer
Only
when it
American
started.
officer.
Yeah, the only American officer. That's true. Actually, in the whole French army when it started. Yeah. So these are the kind of comparisons that we like to do. So look at the two guys in the dark uniforms. Ray Bridgman and Thomas Hewitt. Ray Bridgman was a pacifist before, during, and after the war. You'll see a little video clip of an interview we did with his daughter in a few minutes. He was at Yale. He left Yale. He was deeply opposed to the war and felt just as strongly that he had to go do something about it. He could not be in it, but he hated it. And his letters home, he tries to reconcile those two very opposing things, and he can't. And very, very sensitive, quiet, poetic, artistic man. It eventually kills him. He takes his own life in 1951. And yet he shot down 4 planes. A pacifist who shot down 4 planes. Thomas Hewitt was really promising as a student, as a flight student, came over, you know, once again, got all the way through the training, he's there, the persistence that's required, and the skill and the sheer luck that's required just to get through that. But then the nickname that he earns in the squadron is useless, because he barely flies any missions. He cannot pull it together to do it. They're all ferrying their airplanes from one airfield to another. There's a big ditch at the end of the airfield. Tenno has told him about the big ditch. Don't hit the big ditch. Hewitt just goes right into it. Plow. So Tenno's like, fine, go take a car, go back, get another airplane, and this time bring it back and land it right. Right into the ditch again. Boom. He didn't last long in the and actually wound up dead in a DC flop house from alcohol poisoning. It's a very sad story. You know, this is a real pick-me-up kind of talk. If I haven't induced misery by about 10 minutes in. The other big theme of this thing is France itself and its connection to the United States of America. You know, there are 2 big monument projects of the Belle Epoque after the Franco-Prussian War, the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty. And how often we forget that the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France. And who else does that? When else has that been done when another country takes on a monumental building project and gives it to another country in recognition of the bond between them? That's just amazing. You have one?
Yeah.
What?
The Netherlands, Caroline.
That's very true. That's very true. I would argue that Statue of Liberty's got a little bit more oomph. But nevertheless, but you get the idea of what I'm talking about, and how Paris is very interesting. One of the people you'll see shortly is Dr. Charles Mayer from Harvard University, who teaches World War I, and he talks about how the Germans won the Franco-Prussian War, but the French won the Cultural War afterward. Paris became the cultural center of the world, and the Kaiser apparently was never invited on an official state visit to Paris before the war, and it really got under his skin, apparently dramatically so. Paris, or the French and flight, how the French were the ones who really were skeptical about the Wright brothers' claims of flight, and then when Wilbur flies in 1908 at Le Mans, they completely embrace them and take on who they are, at least for a little while until they started suing Blériot and it got unpleasant. But the fact that they take what the Wrights have invented and run with it, and there's this connection between the French and flight, which is very strong, and how they come over to the United States and start doing exhibition flying, how flight influences art, how these things kind of all sort of collide as cultural stuff often does, and turns Paris into this magnetic place for Americans to go. It's why Victor Chapman is there when the war starts, because he's there to go study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts. So there's this really potent stew that happens as the war, when the fuse is lit, and Archduke and Sophie go down. There's Americans there. There's Americans with a feeling for France. There's Americans who have the opportunity to go do this, but there's something in their character that compels them. And in those who survived, some of them were, you know, honestly, we had no idea what we were doing. But what amazes us is by the time the escadrille is formed, the ones who form it already know how big the war is and how bad the war is, and they decide to go into this new thing that could be even more dangerous. And they do that too. So that kind of persistence is just extraordinary. This is the famous March of the American Volunteers towards the Gare Saint-Lazare to join the Foreign Legion in August 25th, 1914. One of the guys holding the flags, I believe, is Alan Seeger, who was a famous poet. Bill Thaw is in there. Kiffin and Paul Rockwell are in there. Quite an extraordinary thing. We're going to recreate that. see these French Newports. I'm kidding. Just to talk a little bit about some of our approaches to filming. Right now, we don't foresee using any CGI in this film. We want flying sequences to be airplanes flying. So we have, because the filming of Millionaires Unit in New Zealand went so well, and that's the crew who shot it with the red camera mounted onto this helicopter. And when you see the footage, I swear, it is killer. It's so good. New Zealand's rather beautiful, and it's a nice stand-in for France. And man, real rotary engine sound and just beautiful shots of these things. But it gets us, and apparently they've got Eindeckers now. We weren't going to go there because they didn't have the right planes for us to go up against, but they've got a Newport 11 and they've got Eindeckers. So that's kind of, and they've got Albatrosses and the later airplanes that we need. So money willing, and if any of you have a rich uncle, or in fact are a rich uncle, and would like to contribute to this thing, please come and see me afterwards. I can tell you exactly how to make your tax-deductible donation to the 501c3 we're working with. We want the film to make an emotional connection to the audience, that they start to get to know these guys as people, and they start to understand the circumstances truly that they were in and what it felt like. So we are coming up with some very clever ways to get shots of airplanes, the wonderful people who have World War I airplanes and who share them with us and are willing to fly for the film, don't want to turn the airplanes upside down. And they don't want to dive in too fast for very good reasons, but we really need that. So we're coming up with some very clever workarounds that don't involve CGI. So this is the motley crew in France. That's Darroch. This is Mathieu Mazat, who is our cameraman. He's actually from here in DC, but he's French. He grew up in Po, where the Wright brothers had their field, where a lot of these guys trained. And so it's very handy having a French cinematographer in Paris, especially when you're ordering dinner. And he happens to be a great photographer. Dan, and here's truly. So this is at the rededication of the memorial. This was this past April. And how many of you have ever been to the memorial outside Paris? Oh, I can't recommend enough that you go. It's a truly extraordinary place. And sort of the story of the memorial echoes the story of the Escadrille, at least in public opinion. The memorial was dedicated in 1928. There was a private foundation that was there to maintain it, but they blew through the endowment, and eventually there was no money to maintain the thing. It was sinking into the ground. It was crumbling. It was dirty. It was really quite sad. But the French and American governments came together for the centennial of the unit and put the money together to fully restore it. And now it belongs to the American Battlefield Monument Commission, so it will be maintained in perpetuity, which is a really good thing. But this April, we were there to photograph. There's Darroch actually filming, and that's Guillaume, excuse me, Regis. I can't actually tell them apart. And Nick Rutgers meeting for the first time. So there's a chance for the families to kind of get together and sort of have us pull this whole thing full circle. This is John, blanking on his name, Yellow something. Anyway, he's the chief of, he's an Oglala Sioux chief. And he came for the dedication because of the escadrille's use of the war bonnet as their insignia. And he spoke so eloquently about what the war bonnet means and why it means so much to them that the escadrille chose it to represent the United States before the U.S. entered the war. The biggest part about this trip, I think, that really started bringing the war home to us was our trip to Verdun. I had never been there before, and of course I'd read about it, and of course I'd seen pictures and footage and whatever. But to actually be, this is on the top of Fort Douaumont, to see the lunar landscape that a lot of Verdun still is, and to try and just get an idea of the scale of the carnage and just how big just Verdun was. I still don't really, and I don't know if I ever will really wrap my head around it. Looking at the mountains of bones in the ossuary, and just the vastness of the destruction that's still actually there. And that this is what these guys were flying over. As McConnell said, their post was about 30 miles behind the lines, and as they flew over, he described a strip of murdered nature. And it's just, so that feeling, we're going to have to go find a strip of murdered nature somewhere. A strip of murdered nature. That's what he called the front lines. This is the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery, where Victor Chapman is actually buried. Although he's not actually buried there, because there was great confusion about what actually happened to his remains, and but a marker is there for him. So a big part of what we're trying to do is show this story in color. Of course, we'll be using a lot of documentary and archival material. We've been doing a lot of research at places like Washington Lee University, where Paul Rockwell's collection is, and Grinnell College, where James Norman Hall's is, and so on. But we want to have the story in sort of in living color as much as possible. So as far as what we've been doing recently, here's the motley crew with the addition of our good friend Mark Wilkins. On the far left, Mark is, he's a maritime historian, he's an aviation historian, and master model builder of both those things. He and I actually were in the trenches together, so to speak. I was at the National Gallery, and he was at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, doing exhibit production work, and so we both do a bunch of crazy stuff, and he is building the very large-scale models for us, and those are the airplanes that we're going to point straight at the ground and be able to live and roll and so on. So this was shot at the League meeting earlier last year at Russ Turner's place, and it happened to be a rainbow over that Newport type. We filmed at the centennial ceremony for the death of Norman Prince at the National Cathedral. There's his tomb there. And we've been shooting a lot of interviews. We filmed John. I didn't happen to actually take a picture of us filming you, John. I'm sorry. But there's Mike. We've been filming a lot of, a couple of family members. And I'll show you some of this in a few minutes. This is Bill Thaw Whitney, who is the cousin of Bill Thaw. Bill Thaw's father, was a father or grandfather, actually had two separate families, and he's descended from one of them, and Bill Thaw's from the other. But he's a fascinating guy because he's very knowledgeable about his cousin. But it wasn't until he had been a pilot for about 10 years himself that somebody said, "Hey, I was just reading about a Bill Thaw who's a famous pilot." He's like, "Who's that?" He had no idea. He's since become very knowledgeable about the subject. And this is Caroline Bridgman Reese, who is the daughter of Ray Bridgman, who I mentioned before. And we'll see a little bit of her interview shortly. At the end of the day, something like a film, even a documentary film, I think if it's good, it really makes you feel something. We don't want to just have our audience drinking from the fire hose of facts. There's no way we can get it all in a 90-minute film. There's just not, unless we just have somebody running their mouth at full speed, and that's it. It's not going to happen. So we want, if we're successful, they'll come out feeling what we feel about these guys. They'll be curious, and they'll want to learn more. They'll want to come here and see a Newport 28 and the Quadron. They'll have a sense of the sort of sacrifice these guys were willing to put themselves in front of. This is the famous tragic photograph. This was shot soon after the escadrille was formed. There's Captain Tenno at the center, McCall, Kiffin Rockwell, Norman Prince, and Victor Chapman. And Captain Tenno was the only one to survive the war. These three were gone before 1916 was out. He died in 1917. These are two pictures of the same man, shot a few months apart. Yeah. This is Kiffin Rockwell soon after he was, it's about the time of the formation of the escadrille. I don't know if it was just before, during it, or just after, but around then. and this is a few months later, Kiffin would take any opportunity he could to go fight. And so he was flying very high patrols, he was flying the low patrols, and that just the change in altitude, just on a single flight, would take it out of you. And he was doing it day after day after day after day. Every opportunity he could, pushing himself absolutely to the limit. And you can see the toll it took on him. It's absolutely extraordinary. Just getting back to this picture, you've got Doug McMonigal, who goes out with, I'm going to say Parsons, but it might not have been Parsons. Anyway, they go out and get themselves really drunk. McMonigal gets really drunk. And they come back in those wee small hours of the morning, and McMonigal decides it'd be funny to wake Captain Tenno up. And he does, and Tenno is pissed. And the next morning, he makes McMonigal go up on the early patrol, and McMonigal gets shot down and killed. And then his mother shows up at the post to visit, and they had got to tell him. And so it's just one of these sort of, kicking the guts stories. It's just so, really? That happened? We have to have a section in the film of Ted Parsons' description of the amount of alcohol that he drank, and what he would drink before he would go flying, and the drinking that he did while he was flying, and the drinking that he would do immediately after he flew, because it was the only thing that he could do to keep himself from just having a total collapse. And he describes memorably a patrol where he got in a very difficult situation, and he lands, and he's like, wow, I did it, I feel okay, and he gets out and his knees buckle and he crumbles to the ground because he's so terrified. He speaks about the fear in very, very gripping ways, but he's also hilarious, and some of the stupid stuff that they did there. The contrast of just every day going from the ridiculous to sublime in a single flight is just amazing. And then there's trying to come to grips with Raoul Lufbery, who is just this absolute pillar of the unit. When you look at my chart here, I put the numbers of kills, the little crosses, so you can see. And most of them have none. It's very hard to shoot down an airplane. So most of them have none. Some of them have a few. And Lufbery just is, and it's just, his thing is filled with them, and those are just the ones that were officially recorded. But then the irony that Lufbery, and the consensus seems to be, and if any of you are familiar with this story, Lufbery's death, was the plane burning, was it not? Did he fall? Did he jump? I don't know. Right now I'm leaning towards the he fell side, that he didn't buckle his seatbelt. When the airplane turns over, he falls out. This is the best one of them all. He makes that kind of mistake. It's just, or if the plane was burning and he jumped, that's bad enough. It's bringing that kind of, it's reality. It's what happened. Out into the film is what we're really after. And then another part is to, like the memorial itself, is to help in some, I'm not going to be modest and say some small way, I hope in some big way, that we can bring this story forward, that it really attracts attention to the role of American volunteers in the war, this war that still has such a massive impact on us around the world, this war that there was nothing like it before, and everything that has followed, so much of it has come from this. You have to hold these two opposing things in your head, how amazing these guys were under these almost unfathomable circumstances, their persistence, their courage, but then how horrible it was. And I don't know, just the incredible respect that we have for what they did and what it meant. The memorial is a nice, big, huge, beautiful silent actor in our So what I'm going to do now is show you some little bits of it. Let's see. I'll show you some of the recent footage first. So let me just describe what you're going to see. This is barely edited footage. I mean, this is in no particular sequence. So you're just going to, I just want to give you a sense of, this is mostly just some of the little, I'm going to say almost experiments we've been shooting in getting some trench footage and footage of replica airplanes flying, and you'll see a Belgian, Newport in Belgian colors, we know. And some of the interviews. You'll see David Hanna, who wrote a fine book called Rendezvous with Death about the American volunteers in the Foreign Legion, and he'll be talking about Kiffen Rockwell. You'll see Charles Mayer from Harvard talking about the role of the airplane in World War I. You'll see Mike talking about, O'Neill talking about the how the escadrille sort of figures what its impact was in the immediate milieu of the war, and then Caroline Bridgman Reese talking about her father Ray. So, this was shot at the Great War Association gathering in Pennsylvania, just to kind of get some idea of what does it look like to see one of these.
There was a bit of elitist in him.
Trench.
He could be very
So, this is David Hanna talking about Kiffen Rockwell.
judgmental, and once he made up his mind that you weren't, you hadn't measured up, that was it. However, his idea of what a gentleman didn't necessarily fit the sort of Victorian or Edwardian attitudes of that class at that time, in the sense that it wasn't necessarily where you'd gone to school or how much money your parents had or who your parents were necessarily, though oftentimes it would work that way. It was who you were as a person, how you acted as a man, how you acted towards your inferiors, how you acted towards women, children, how you carried yourself under pressure. Did you have grace? He really, he was somebody, I think, if you had gained his friendship, I think that would have been somebody that was a friend. I would love to have met him, but I don't, and I can tell you this, I would never, ever have wanted to be his enemy. He's the last person on earth, if I were German in that war, I would have wanted to have to deal with. He was formidable, and there's a dark element to him. He wanted to kill Germans, and I think that to some people, I think that comes across as it's a bit much, but he really felt that way.
It's an interesting weapon because, in contrast, in the First World War, most of this war seems to be fought between hundreds of thousands of soldiers trapped in trenches or confined to trenches. It's an almost anonymous war on the ground because of the hugeness of the number of participants. And here, against that backdrop, you have this almost chivalric sense of guys who are going up in small, frail machines of canvas and metal and engaging in these jousts in the air, so that the air war itself has this romanticism which the land war works to destroy. So that juxtaposition makes for good reportage, makes for good publicity. When you get a group of young people committing themselves, that makes a difference. They look at the freedom marches in 1964 in the South. They did make a difference, but the fact they're there as representatives of some higher cause, and they're putting their bodies or safety on the line in some way, this is important.
They started out in a quiet sector. They were inexperienced pilots. They didn't have a bunch of experienced French pilots to fly with them, so there wasn't this sort of continuity of training as they got there. They were kind of learning on the job. But that alone doesn't measure their value. Their value was in primarily in maintaining the knowledge, the awareness of the American people of what was going on in France during the war. Their propaganda value, if you will, was way more important than anything that they did in the air. So as a squadron, they're sort of an average French squadron. They're not the worst French, and certainly not the best, but I think their value was more in the field of engaging the American public in what the situation was in France and why Americans should be involved in this European conflict when President Wilson was trying to keep us out of it.
I'll just stop here. Caroline Bridgman Reese, she lives up in New Haven, and I managed to track her down. Ancestry.com is an amazing thing if you want to find these people. And I got in touch with her son, who got me to her, and I called her up, and she said, as you'll hear, she's got a wonderful voice, and she just said, yes, well, you know, I am 94, and if you're going to interview, you better do it now. I feel fine, but something strange is going on with my leg, and you just better come now. So we got there, and yeah, well, as I said, her father was the one who sadly took his own life, and she was just great.
I knew that Daddy had been in the war and in flying, and that it had been very, very difficult and tragic. He remembered it with horror, and he probably had a sense of guilt, though we never talked about it. I would have had a sense of guilt, but I'm sure he did. I'm sure he knew that but he perhaps understood that he had to do it at that particular moment with his mindset, with what he knew was happening in Europe. This impelled him to go through it. But he knew all the time that he was close to murder and death. He was sort of a ghost a lot of the time. He was a beautiful, quiet person. But then on the other side, I don't want to be too intimate, but my mother never got over his not being a normal, affable human being that he had been.
That makes you feel good, doesn't it? I'm conscious of my time that I'm pretty much at the end of it, and I hope you don't have any questions. I can show the little teaser that we've got. It's about 2.5 minutes. Would you like to see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. But I don't want to encroach too much on I know you're fast and loose with the time, but don't want to gum it up too much. All right, I'll show you the little teaser. Before I launch this, I will say that this has not changed since we showed it in Dayton. So I'm aware that the footage of Bill Thaw in the beginning is Bill Thaw in the 103rd Pursuit, not in the Lafayette Escadrille, and that the film is for some reason flipped, and that's why he's saluting with the wrong hand. So, and whatever the other goofs in the thing are, they're still there. So if you can spot them, remind me. Go on, baby.
100 years ago,
a handful of disparate, nonconformist, idealistic, young American men threw in their lot to fly for France when Germany declared war in 1914. France has not forgotten them. Some were heroes, some were scoundrels. 8 were Harvard graduates, 3 had little or no formal education at all. 9 fought in the trenches before learning to fly. 3 were architects, 1 a reporter. 1 was a pacifist. 2 flew as mercenaries on opposite sides of the Mexican Civil War. 1 was a physician. Another had been a human cannonball. 1 was blind in one eye and deaf in one ear. The youngest was 20. The oldest, 40. They all had personal reasons to go to war, but the general consensus was, as one of them memorably said, "I pay my way for Lafayette and Rochambeau, the 2 gallant Frenchmen who rushed to our shores to aid our struggle for independence a century earlier." They served in every major campaign from one side of the Western Front to the other, flying over majestic landscapes and brutal battlefields. This group of 38 volunteers inspired more than 200 other Americans to fly for France before America entered World War I. They were embarking on a grand adventure. Aviation was brand new. Industrial warfare was yet to be identified as such, the scope of the war not completely known. Yet each of them was willing to lay down his life for the ideals of liberty that France embodied. "100 years later, they are remembered at the rededication of a memorial outside Paris, where 49 of them are entombed. The ceremony included speeches, anthems, salutes, and pageantry. Historic planes flew over Paris, demonstrating the City of Light's continuing gratitude. Their families met, gathered together, most for the first time, in remembrance of what their forebears did for France, for America, and for the world.
Okay, hang on. Okay.
The American aviators who flew for France. This is their story.
Oh, come on, don't do that. Oh, the big happy music is goofed out. Oh well, I'm not going to sing it. Just imagine a band doing this. Great. So,